This is Glenn Fulsher with another issue of Language Testing Bites. Welcome to Language Testing Bites 34. This is a very different podcast from the 33 that I've produced in the past, because it's the last one that I will edit. From issue 35, there'll be a new podcast editor who will also be an associate editor of the Sage journal Language Testing, to which the podcast is attached. The first issue of Language Testing Bites was released back in the spring of 2010, and until 2015 there were 4 podcasts per year, one for each issue of the journal. In 2016 we went to 2 podcasts per year, and this explains the 34 podcasts over a period of 11 years. However, my association with the journal is much longer than this. I first joined the editorial board of Language Testing in 2001, when the journal was still published by Edward Arnold Press. I became co-editor of the journal with Cathy Elder of the University of Melbourne in 2007, and I finally stood down as editor at the end of 2015. So after 20 years of serving the journal in these various capacities, I think it's time to hand over the podcast to someone from the next generation of scholars and to leave the editorial board. This is part of the winding down of commitments prior to my impending retirement in 2024. Now, during the pandemic lockdowns of 2020 and early 2021, I have been rereading my favourite Stoic authors. And drawing this part of my career to a close brings to mind the penetrating analysis of life provided by Marcus Aurelius from Book 4, verse 36 of the Meditations. And I quote, "Some things are hurrying to come into being, others are hurrying to be gone. And part of that which is being born is already extinguished. Flows and changes are constantly renewing the world, just as the ceaseless passage of time makes eternity ever young. In this river, then, where there can be no foothold, what should anyone prize of all that races past him? It is as if he were to begin to fancy one of the little sparrows that fly past, but already is gone from his sight. Indeed, this is the very nature of our lives, as transient as the exhalation of vapour from the blood or the breath drawn from the air." Reflecting on that passage, one of the things that I prize from the past 20 years and more is my service to this, the premier journal in our field of language testing and assessment. And in this final podcast, I'm firstly going to reflect on the philosophy that has guided my editorial practice during my time with the journal. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I'm going to revisit 3 podcasts that I have remembered because they provided me with those moments of sudden realization and insight that triggered my own thinking in particular areas. So firstly, editorial philosophy. While this may vary between edited volumes, a journal and a podcast, for me one principle holds in each case. I have never believed that it is the role of an editor to silence arguments or change the evidence or views of contributors, or to attempt to frame the content in such a way that it assimilates others to the editor's worldview. I've always believed that John Stuart Mill was absolutely correct in his position expressed in his essay on liberty that, and I quote, "Wrong opinion and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, but the facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be put before it." End quote. Progress is not achieved without free debate and vigorous argument, and a recognition, at least on the part of an enlightened, and I may add enlightenment editor, that we all have the potential to be wrong. Producing language testing bites has had practical limitations too, primarily regarding the quality of the recording options, the length of the podcast set by the publisher, and the requirement to give maximum speaking time to the featured contributor. So putting the primary editorial principle into practice has resulted in a question answer format where the questions were not designed to challenge or question the contributor's views, but to provide hooks upon which the contributor could talk about their research questions, their methodologies, their findings, and what they think they were contributing to the field. In every podcast, I tried to keep my own views and references to my own work out of the podcast, with the sole exception of podcast 33. And if you listen to that podcast, I hope you will agree that it was legitimate and not too intrusive. Looking to the future, I hope that the editorial philosophy that I have stuck with will outlive my 20 years with the journal, but I'm sure that it can and will take other formats rather than the format that I have stuck with. In the pandemic years, we've become used to new technologies, and platforms like Zoom now allow the possibility of group discussion with quality audio, which has not been possible for most of my time as podcast editor. Indeed, the first podcasts were recorded synchronously over a telephone using what was then a state-of-the-art earpiece microphone. The quality issues were considerable, especially as noise suppression and removal technology was in its infancy. But enough of what may be in the future, because that's not my decision to make, and enough of the technical issues of the past. The most important part of planning a podcast is content that challenges and informs. It gives new ideas, it leads to innovative research, and contributes to the growth of the field. So I come to the second part of this podcast, which is my personal selection of 3 moments from the 33 previous podcasts that I have edited. Now, any selection like this is inevitably personal, but these were moments that have stuck in my memory because they were wow moments for me. Examples of those critical episodes when we start to think about what we do in very new ways. And although I didn't plan this, one is from the very early days of the podcast, one from close to the middle, and the last one is very recent. So my first selection is taken from the very first podcast that I made, which featured Mike Kane talking about validation. He had just taken up the Messick chair at Educational Testing Service when I interviewed him in 2010, and he had written the validation chapter in the 4th edition of Educational Measurement, which was the successor chapter to Messick's validity chapter of 1989. And in the podcast, I quoted a paper by Chappell and her colleagues, in which they claimed that constructs were not necessary to the construction of interpretative arguments. And I asked him what he thought about construct definition. Listen again to my question and his response.
Well, I'd just like to follow up on that and your definitions by asking about the place of constructs in your approach. I recently read a 2010 paper by Carol Chappell and colleagues in Educational Measurement Issues and Practice, entitled "Does an Argument-Based Approach to Validity Make a Difference?" And they say that they found the approach that you've just described to be a very practical and pragmatic approach to structuring a test design project, one in which they couldn't clearly define a construct and operationalize that construct. Now, what they say, and I'm going to quote this to you, is Keynes' organizing concept of an interpretive argument, which does not rely on a construct, proved to be useful. Now, do you think that we can bypass construct definition in the way that they imply is possible?
I think we can. One of the problems, I'm not really crazy about construct language, mainly because construct now in our literature has so many different meanings that unless you specify what you mean by a construct at the beginning of an article, nobody would know what you were talking about. If you discussed constructs in the original version in Cronbach and Meal, a construct is a theoretical entity embedded in a sort of mathematical, or at least a formal theory, and the construct is implicitly defined by the theory, something like, entropy in thermodynamics or something else. Now, we don't have constructs like that. We don't have theories like that in lots of areas in which we work. In a few, we might have something that approximates it. That notion sort of was associated with the logical positivist to some extent, and is less probably central to philosophy of science now. So then constructs became sort of general ideas of what we're talking about, and were defined in terms of any connection with anything. So you get these statements in the literature where any connection between your variable and any other variable is grist for the mill in validity, and it makes it really difficult to know what to do. If there are an infinite number of possible things you could look at, and no criteria for saying which one you should do first, you tend to grind to a halt. So I think construct language helps in some areas. Like, I think if you're talking about lots of psychological attributes, personality characteristics like aggressiveness and so on, construct language makes sense, and you can do something that sort of approximates Cronbach and Meal to some extent. And that was the area in which Cronbach and Meal introduced the concept to deal with. I mean, they explicitly said that they introduced construct validity to deal with measures of attributes like aggressiveness or intuitive ability or something that couldn't be defined in terms of content domains and couldn't be defined in terms of predicting some criterion. So in some areas I think it works. In some areas I think defining content domains makes sense. And all of those can be subsumed under the general notion of an interpretive argument. So I prefer not to focus so much on construct language, mainly because I think it has so many meanings that it's meaningless now.
Until this moment, I'd always thought of the argument approach to validity, which is now mainstream in educational measurement, as building upon Messick. But this moment in the podcast made me realise that it was really part of a fracturing of the Messick consensus. Removing construct language excludes the use of abstract nouns that summarise components of observable performance in terms of underlying knowledge, skills or abilities. As I've wrestled with this in the subsequent 11 years, culminating in my own Messick Memorial Lecture in 2021, I've realised that Keynes' preference for content language, as expressed in this extract, has driven test design approaches that begin with domain description and progress to the creation of tasks that attempt to replicate what goes on within a domain. Performance on a task is then interpreted as evidence for or against the claim that the test taker can cope with similar tasks in the target domain. It now appears to me that this does two things. Firstly, it takes us back to the kinds of really authenticity arguments of the communicative language testing era, with a focus on content that derives from a modern form of needs analysis. Secondly, it's a utilitarian process-based approach, similar to arriving at a judgment in legal proceedings. And I think Tim McNamara is essentially right when he says, and I quote, "In the case of both legal and assessment settings, the focus is on procedures used. If the procedures are faulty, then the conclusions about particular individuals will most likely be unsound." That's the end of the quote. And I think this is why Kane's chapter in educational measurement is called validation, while Messick's was called validity. But when I look at the Toulmin argument structures in validation arguments in language testing, the rebuttals are almost always framed in terms of Messick's construct irrelevance or construct underrepresentation. And the evidence components exactly reflect those of Messick's, minus the consequences of testing, because instrumentalist approaches have almost nothing to say about consequences. Now, the appropriation of Toulmin argument structure to validity in language testing is no doubt a major contribution, and it will endure, I am sure. But I do not believe that the abolition of construct language has been at all helpful. My second extract is from the podcast that I made with Alan Davis in 2013 on assessing academic English. Alan was a towering figure in applied linguistics and language testing. I could have made many excellent podcasts just by interviewing Alan on topics as diverse as ethics and consequences, the native speaker, and uncertainty, to mention but a few. He was a polymath with expertise from philosophy and language to measurement theory. But in this extract, he talked to me about his 2008 book on testing academic English, in which he referred to the English language testing system, which was the forerunner to what we now know as IELTS, as a communicative interlude. I asked him what he meant by this, and here is his response.
At the time, this would have been in the mid to late 1970s, mid-1970s, I suppose. There was a strong influence of work on English, or indeed language, for specific purposes. That was very fashionable at the time. And the British Council in particular had become interested in that, partly because of the work of one of their officers, John Munby, who had written his PhD thesis, which was precisely on that issue. They were very influenced by that. One of his colleagues in the British Council, Brendan Carroll, was particularly interested in it, and it was Brendan who took this on. The communicative idea was at the time that what the test should do is to simulate as far as possible the demands placed on students when they were studying in this country, in their subject areas. And so there were two things really involved. So it was thought. One was the fact that they needed to interact with other, with their teachers and so on. And the more important one was that they needed to know the English of their subject area. And so the English language testing service test was communicative largely because it set out to provide different tests for different academic areas. In point of fact, it didn't get further than 6 areas. And these 6 areas were related to the different departmental distinctions that the British Council itself, when it was receiving students and assigning scholarships. So there was a test for medicine, for example, and there was a test for engineering, and there was a test for social studies, I think, or social sciences. Why do I call it an interlude? Well, the fact is that it proved to be very, very difficult to apply. The English Language Testing Service was developed towards the end of the 1970s and put into action and lasted for a further 10 years. So it was actually put into use. And it was, as I think I say in the book, in spite of its difficulties, it demonstrated a kind of creative approach to testing, and also it showed the real difficulty of trying to test in exactly the same way as you might teach required a large amount of material in order to provide tests for all these different areas. And I called this the problem of the logic of language-specific testing. The problem was that it was necessary in a proficiency test, divided into 6 or a small number of areas. It was necessary to provide for all in those areas. And to do, there was a kind of regression to the mean, as it were, in the sense that it was necessary to reduce difficulty and the speciality of the area so that it fitted everybody in that area. A good example that is often quoted was that in medicine, if you're going to have a test of medical English, what is it you base it on? Do you base it on texts for psychiatrists, for example, or for surgeons, or for physicians, or for anesthetists, or what is it you do? Because many of those who came here to study medicine had themselves already gained qualifications in their own country and indeed already begun to specialize in different areas. And some of them were years from general medicine, which is what they had studied in the first place. And so what they found was that the test was too specialist enough for them. And so the inevitable was that in order to make a test apply to everybody taking it, it had to be very easy, rather like a Reader's Digest test. And that's what I've called the problem, the logic or the illogic of language-specific tests, and also why it was an interlude, because it was found during the 1980s that this was not satisfactory.
I don't think the issue of which Alan Davies was so much aware throughout his long career has ever gone away. Alan made me think about the relationship between the statement of test purpose, test design, and how these impact on the soundness of inferences we can draw from a score to likely future performance in non-test settings. Charles Alderson and Caroline Clapham were also hugely important in this debate about how specific is specific. And today we still face arguments at opposite ends of the spectrum. So on the one hand, we get arguments like those that Fred Davidson and I use in our test retrofit argument, that any deviation in test use from its original purpose should not only result in the production of new validity evidence, but that the test itself should be retrofitted with new content, new tasks, new scoring mechanisms that are relevant to the new purpose. And that's driven by new test constructs. And at the other end of the line, there are claims that sentence repetition tasks elicit information on language processing that can be scored, and the score meaning can be generalized to draw inferences about likely performance in real-world academic contexts. Now, this isn't just a difference, a technical difference about generalizability, but a fundamental issue of whether the observable and countable performance elements are direct evidence of cognitive language ability, or whether these observable elements require interpreting through high inference categories. Because, as the argument would go, language is a shared human resource for making a multiplicity of meaning that goes well beyond what is countable. If language performs social functions that are context dependent, then do we still need some level of specificity and human rather than machine scoring? These are not just language testing issues, they're philosophical questions, which is why Alan Davis was so good at addressing them. I contributed myself to this debate in 1999 when my paper on academic English was published in the journal Applied Linguistics. As a result of this extract, my discussion with Alan Davis in this podcast, I've often revisited my 1999 paper and realised that while I still think content should not be the driving argument, I would fundamentally now disagree with myself when I wrote in that paper that perhaps the persistence of academic content in tests of academic English would be a matter of response validity. If I could unpublish a paper, that is the one I would unpublish. But perhaps this is the lesson to draw from Alan's extract and how this podcast has changed my thinking. Language testing is not just a matter of language testing. To do it well, we must engage with questions about the kinds of society we wish to live in and what the role of language testing is, what we think the purpose and nature of language is, and indeed why language is fundamental to a definition of humanity. This is why Alan Davis was as much a philosopher as he was a language tester. Something we need to emulate. This brings me to the third and final extract, which is taken from Language Testing Bites 30, in which I interviewed Bart Dagers about language assessment literacy for university admissions. Language assessment literacy is another area in which I've worked, although I've been concerned with language teachers. Policymakers and people who make decisions using language test scores have never really been on my radar, although I am aware of other work in this area, such as Jay Banerjee's PhD thesis. But of course it was Linda Taylor's exploratory paper that suggested that there might be different assessment literacy needs for different groups of people who engage with or use language test scores. But until recently, there hasn't been much empirical research in this area for people other than language teachers. Perhaps this is because policymakers are just so difficult to access, as a number of authors have suggested. When I talked to Bart about his research, there was another one of those moments that made me realise that I had made many uncritical assumptions that kept my own language testing and assessment world safe and comfortable. I asked him about how policy that uses language tests is made at both institutional and government level. And this is his response.
I think what is true for policy at all levels is that it is messy. Of course, in policy, there are a lot of different dynamics to consider, to juggle with. Empirical research only has minor influence, I must say. I met with government policymakers who said, well, it's not because research will show something that we will inevitably act upon those research results. Because those research results would need to be reconciled with, for example, budget concerns, with institutional politics, but also with national and international politics, with what other institutions do, with how the media is reporting at a certain point in time, but also with ideology, with folk beliefs, and then with a number of uncontrollable random variables. So the policy making is a very, very complicated, complex business and policymakers, and I do understand it actually more than I did in the past. I do understand that they sometimes do not have the luxury to simply focus on research results. That is a luxury that we as researchers have more than policymakers have. About similarities and differences, well, we found that at the government level, politics, of course, play a more important role than at the institutional level. But of course, institutional politics also play a role. That would be, for example, power dynamics between different powerful departments at a university that could influence and impact policy. Budget concerns at a university could definitely impact policy. There have been numerous examples of universities, not just in Flanders, but really all around the world, changing language requirements for budget needs. For example, lowering them if they want more international students or increasing them if they want fewer.
This is a major contribution by Bart's. I had read his paper with Margaret Malone in the journal, of course, but it was hearing this in the podcast that really brought it home. My rants about the policy misuse of test scores are little more than whispers in a typhoon. Is it really the case that I'm just a very small cog in a very large machine? If we engage with policymakers, do we provide them with the tests they need to achieve political or policy ends that we may not approve of? If not, how do we engage with them so that we are not an irrelevance? This is the beginning of another avenue of research for which we will need multidisciplinary collaboration, including philosophy and ethics, as well as technical language testing research and development skills. However, it's not an endeavour of which I will be a part, given my impending retirement. But I will continue to read the journal and listen to the podcast under new editorial leadership. And I look forward to reading and hearing about the progress of the language testing field as it is pushed forward by the next generation of scholars and researchers. Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bites. Language Testing Bites is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bites through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bites.